Que las palabras de mi boca y la meditación de mi corazón sean aceptables a ti, oh Señor, mi fuerza, mi redentor. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. So as our Lenten series has continued, it's just been a very wonderful experience, more experiential than lecture. And this past week, we practiced and learned about centering prayer. And Bob Runyon was our leader, and we used the gospel from today as the basis from which to meditate during the centering prayer. And so there was a discussion. We did a Lectio Divina, where you read the scriptures 3 times, and then people share what they think or what called to them. And so there was a lot of questions about this idea of Jesus, being so angry. And what did that mean? And why would Jesus be so angry when, after all, what was going on in the temple had been going on for years and years and years, generations? So why now? Why would Jesus be upset now? And we really didn't get an answer for it. There was a lot of speculation and so forth. A lot of interesting comments were made. And then I read the first lesson. And the very first, in case you all didn't get what the first lesson was, it was the 10 Commandments. Did y'all recognize that? Yay! But this time, when the 10 Commandments were read, they were not just kind of sort of grocery listed. There was a little bit of an explanation on some of these. Now, there was a couple that need no explanation, like thou shalt not murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. Those didn't need a lot of commentary. But in the very first commandment, it says this: Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. That was the first commandment. That was number 1. All of that explanation to state the first commandment, to love God and put no idols before God. But what was happening by the time of Jesus' time was that there wasn't just this list of 10 commandments. By this time, there were like 660 rules and regulations and so forth. It had become a burden. The whole institution of the temple, the worship and all of that had become so burdensome to the people that nobody could keep up. And so Jesus came and he turned the tables. And he said, no more. This can't stand anymore. Look at what Jesus said. He uses these words throughout all of intermixed in all of the scriptures that we hear. I am the new covenant. I came to make all things new. I came that you might have new life and have it abundantly. Jesus came to change the paradigm, to change the culture of the existing temple worship. He turned the tables, literally turning the tables over. He turned tables on them because it had become something that was not intended. So let me tell you a story. A man feared that his wife was going deaf, and he tried an experiment. He placed himself at one end of a very long room, and she was sitting at the other end of the long room. And from one end of the room to the other, he said, "Can you hear me?" Nothing. So he moved to the middle of the room, and he said, "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. So finally, he comes right up to where she is, And he says to her, "Can you hear me?" And she says, "For the third time, I can hear you." She wasn't the one with the problem. You know, sometimes we're being told things. Jesus is trying to tell us things, and we don't hear. So Jesus came and he turned the tables, just like the wife turned the tables on the husband. Jesus overturned the money changers' tables. I've come to bring you something new. I'm the new covenant. Things have to be different now. Business as usual can't stand anymore. Because business as usual in this particular case, in the case of the temple worship, wasn't working. It was becoming just an overwhelming thing for the people. And really nobody could keep up. Nobody could manage all of the rules and regulations. I mean, going from 10 to 660 something. I mean, that's too much. It's too much for anybody to carry around. And so today, when we did our penitential rite at the beginning of the service, there's a line that says, the 2 commandments are this: love God, love your neighbor. That's it. So the 10 commandments could even be shortened to those 2. And yet at the time of Jesus, there were all of these rules. So yeah, he was mad. He was angry. And also remember, just on a historical footnote, this is the Gospel of John. John was the last of the Gospels that was written. By the time that John was written, the actual temple that Jesus is referring to, that Jesus visited during his lifetime, had been destroyed. It was totally knocked down. And by the time of this writing, they already knew that it had been knocked down. And so John, in his theology of the gospel, he's saying that the disciples remembered that it was really, he was talking about himself, that at his death he would rise again in 3 days. So the temple, in the way that Jesus was speaking about it in this story, he was talking about himself. I think that's absolutely good explanation for what Jesus was talking about. But I think that it is also the fact that it was time for something new to happen. It was time for there to be this other reality. So Jesus came to proclaim the kingdom, the new kingdom of God. And he came to show people about what that would look like. And it didn't look like all of these rules and regulations. I mean, the money changers had to be there. The way the system had evolved, the money changers had to be there because the temple could only accept certain coinage. So you had to exchange money. I was in Jerusalem a couple of years ago for sabbatical, and the money changers are still there. And I didn't like them. Their rate of exchange was really bad, and so there was one in particular. I only did it once because you can fool me once, okay, but so I exchanged $300, and the guy charged me like $50 to exchange $300, and I thought, wow, these money changers need to have their tables upturned, but I didn't do it. But I didn't use them anymore either. But anyway, so money changers were kind of a part of the scene at the time, because that's how temple worship had evolved. You had to have certain kind of money in order to go offer in the temple, and the livestock was there also because there were all these rules about what kind of sacrifice was required for certain things. So there were doves, and there were lambs, and there were ox, and so forth, and these things cost money. So first of all, you had to know what kind of a sacrifice you had to make. You had to have the right money. You had to have enough money, and this everybody was expected to fall in line with what was going on. And Jesus saw that it was too much, so he said, "No more." Now, fast forward to our time. What is it that's going on in our time that needs to be upended and overturned? where business as usual really isn't working anymore. Well, there's a town that up in the north who is making money from very poor population. And what they do is, if you're not walking like on the sidewalk correctly or something, you get a fine. And if you park a certain way, you get a fine. And I mean, they've got all kinds of ways for you to get a fine. And so this town is raising millions of dollars off the poorest people, because then when you don't pay the fine right away, then they have penalties on the fines. And it just snowballs, and pretty soon you're just owe the city so much money, and this is business as usual. But the people said finally, no, that's not fair, that's not just. So they rose up and they protested against it. No more business as usual, because business as usual in that city meant a disparity between who was actually supporting the coffers, or who was putting money in the coffers of the city. Another example of business as usual that finally got upended to a certain extent was in the 60s and 70s. Many people discovered that big companies were putting all kinds of waste into rivers and lakes and spewing into the air and stuff, and people began to notice that they were getting sick and so forth. But it was acceptable business practice. It had been going on for years, since the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s to pretty much the end of the 1900s. That was business as usual. You just did that, and it was okay. But then finally the people said, no, we're getting sick from this. It's not fair. The air, it needs to be fit to breathe and so forth. So during Nixon's administration, he formed the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, because he said business as usual doesn't work anymore. It's time to turn the tables. And so while that worked to a certain extent, I mean, there's still a ways to go on that. But now, if we brought it closer to where we are, in the church, what is business as usual in the church? Well, one thing that I can think of that is I think rather difficult and awkward is how we determine which churches are doing well and which are not. And so we have to turn in a report to the National Church every year. And one of the big metrics of this report, it's called the parochial report. And one of the big metrics of this report is the average Sunday attendance, ASA. And that's supposed to determine how vibrant your congregation is. Well, I don't know. Thanksgiving Day, some of you have heard this story already because I told it during annual meeting. Thanksgiving Day, Trinity Center decided to do a Thanksgiving dinner for all the homeless. And so we invited all the homeless, and we had like maybe 40 or 50 homeless people show up. And we also put on Trinity Center's website that we were looking for volunteers on Thanksgiving Day around lunchtime, like from lunch to like around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We were going to be serving, and we were going to need volunteers from that time period. So people who were looking for a place to serve on that day signed up. And so there were like maybe 40 or 50 people signed up to volunteer that day. But the actual day of Thanksgiving Day, we had almost 100 people here who volunteered. Not the homeless, the volunteers. So, of course, seeing all these people, and very few of them were parish members. We did have some parish members show up, but most of the people that came were not from this church. And in talking to them, many of them didn't go to a church. Yet they wanted to serve. They wanted to be a part of something that was selfless. And so I suggested during the annual meeting that perhaps we need to rethink how we determine what's a vibrant church. Because while our average Sunday attendance is creeping downwards, what we do in the community and the impact that we have in the community is going up. We do a lot in the community. Our activities have diminished very little. So people are doing the gospel work, but they're not showing up on Sundays. So what's the true measure of how well our church is doing? Is it by counting numbers, or is it by actually doing ministry, which doesn't get counted? So there's a disconnect. And then for us, as a parish, can we wrap our heads around the fact that, and please hear me clearly here. I'm not saying it's okay for y'all not to come to church on Sundays, okay? Because a lot of us are already doing that. I don't want to increase that. And I want to say a little bit more about that later. But the thing is that we need to understand that belonging to a church may come from a different way than Sunday morning coming to the worship. That belonging to the church might be in service, like in the parish hall, like when we had the Stop Hunger Now activity, or when we had the Thanksgiving activity, or other, big events that we have where lots of people show up because they want to do something. Now here's the part where coming to church on Sunday connects with that, and why it's important for us to continue to have our Sunday morning worship. Because the people who came on that Thanksgiving day were looking for a place to make a difference, to feel good about doing something good, which that's not bad. But if that's your only motivation, you're only going to have to do it once or twice. You go get your shot of, I feel good, I'll go do this thing once a year, and then I'll feel good, and done. The thing about coming to church on Sunday is that it feeds you and nurtures you and continues to give you ideas about how you do that all the time. Not just once or twice a year, but that it's a lifestyle. It's not an occasional event, but a way of life. And so how do we make that change? How do we turn that corner from expecting that people will come to church and then get enthusiastic about doing stuff, but when actually there's a lot of people who are enthusiastic about doing stuff, and then how do we say to them, come to church on Sunday so that you can continue getting this feeling of how you go about doing stuff all the time? Is Jesus giving us some direction here? Has Jesus been speaking to us? And we haven't been hearing. Maybe we're in this long room, and Jesus, continually tries to get closer and closer to us. Can you hear me yet? Can you hear me yet? Have we heard yet? I wonder. Amen.